that Ken doesn't know how to edit.
Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. A few shows back, we did a rather, I would say, intense show on the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and many of the events and what they participated in together through the years and how they influenced each other. And I brought along three friends of mine who are big Dylan experts, as well as very big Beatle fans, of course. So we're bringing them back so we can continue with the conversation. We took it all the way up to and including the concert for Bangladesh, and there's plenty more to talk about. I would highly recommend, if you didn't see the first show, to go check it out. It's show number 124. We bring back Jeff Slate, New York musician who writes his own music, does lots of tribute shows in the New York area for people like John Lennon, George Harrison, David Bowie, Tom Petty, and coming up in a couple of months, Mick Jagger for his 80th birthday. And he's also a music journalist, and he's also interviewed Bob Dylan. He did so last year with the release of Bob's book. Welcome back, Jeff.
Hey, everybody.
Jeffrey.
Also, we have a guy whose real name is Dylan Sevey, who comes from Nashville. And he also is a musician, plays guitar and drums, and he's in a band called the Minks. And they're about to do their assault on the United States on tour. I didn't write this. I'm just winging it here.
Yikes.
But there's a lot of dates in the New York, New England area for Dylan and his band, and you can check them out on my website. As a matter of fact.
If you want to be assaulted. I'm not going to let that go. I love that.
He's actually playing at a club that's 10 minutes from my house, and I won't be able to see it. And James McCartney played there several years ago at Cafe 9.
Yeah.
Oh, I played there. Good club.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about it then. Oh, well. Dylan, welcome back.
Thanks for letting me assault you, Ken. It's good to be here.
Anytime I want to be assaulted, I'll think of you. Andy Nicholes is back. He is one half of the very popular solo Paul McCartney podcast called Two Legs, along with Tom Hunyadi. And he also has his own separate podcast, The Other Leg. Apart from talking about the Beatles and Paul all the time, he's a huge Dylan fan, which I wasn't even aware of until just recently. So welcome back, Andy.
Thanks for having me, Ken. And good to see you guys as well, Jeff and Dylan. I feel like I've known you for about 10 years now.
Well, the last show lasted about 10 years, yeah.
It could have, and the comments were pretty. There were some interesting comments on your channel, Ken,
Yes,
about that show.
I might respond to some of those comments here if I have the time. But let's pick up where we left off with the concert for Bangladesh. And I know that there was a quote from Bob where he was so thrilled with the way things turned out that he actually said there should have been a third show. So what effect, if any, do you think that concert had on Bob? Did it really energize him to make him want to return to the stage more often? Did it have any effect at all? Jeff?
I mean,
All right, Dylan.
Go ahead, Dylan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the next year on New Year's Eve, he joined the band at the Academy of Music in New York, which was then eventually released as their Rock of Ages live album, killer live album. But it wasn't till 74 that he made his return to touring, and he essentially took most, if not all, of 72 off, if I remember correctly. So I don't know how much this really energized him, but even if it just did for a night, I'd say it was worth it.
Andy, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Just a little bit, even if it was just a little bit before, obviously that tour, and then, the February of 74 tour, before the flood and all that stuff, really, the screaming tour, shouting tour.
Jeff, do you think this in any way affected him being at the concert for Bangladesh?
Nope.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just wondering. I mean, you guys are the experts on Dylan.
I mean, it could have.
Which it kind of makes it that much more legendary and fascinating. The fact that it is sort of this, one-off curio, and he did such an incredible job with it.
I mean, he went and did a movie afterwards, so I mean, come on.
Yeah.
A lot of people point to it as possibly being the highlight of the show.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
for
But,
sure.
I mean, he knows how to do the job, but I think, by all accounts, he had a great time, but it wasn't like it set him on a particular trajectory, or he was writing, went back to writing topical songs, or, I mean, I think it was just sort of like you said, a one-off.
Okay.
Yeah, this was still sort of in his the tail end of his domestic bliss sort of era, which had kind of been, since whatever 67, 68, and lasted through about 72, 73. So, but yeah, really glad it happened. I mean, it's so difficult to say what is the highlight of the show, because the whole show is incredible. You can't discount, Billy Preston or Leon Russell or anything that George did, but
you can discount Clapton.
It's not his finest moment musically, or look at that shot. Come on. I mean,
priceless.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, George deserves so much credit for putting it together on short notice.
Yeah.
And still not knowing until the last minute whether Dylan was going to perform at all. That would have been a pretty short concert without it.
And then that shot of Bob ended up being the cover for his Greatest Hits Volume 2, which came out later that year. So yeah, obviously Bob really valued that night on multiple levels.
Okay, I want to point out, as I did in our previous show, a big thanks to Dylan, because he provided with me this incredible chronology of events that happened, and he's got almost everything I could think of in here. Forgot a few things that I will point out, but that's fine. November 28th of 1971, I always like to read quotes here from interviews. In the New York Times, Bob Dylan said, "I said not to follow leaders, to watch parking meters. It was that simple. I wasn't going to fall for that, for being any kind of leader. The media made up that crap, that Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles were leaders. We didn't know anything about it. And what's more, didn't want any part of it." Later in the same interview, he says, "Did you see the John Lennon interview in Rolling Stone? Ooh, Lennon was completely out of control. He's leaving no place for himself. Me, I got to keep a place for me. I like Lennon, though. I dig him a lot. He's given me a lot of insight. Don't ask me how. It's just good that he's around."
Yeah, I think that is... I just think it's so telling, kind of like what we were talking about, last episode, just the relationship that those two had, kind of at a distance, but with so much respect, so much curiosity, fascination. They were never destined to be super, super close, but, very, very much birds of the same feather. And I just love too that Dylan commented on the winter interview at all. And telling it like it is, saying, "Yeah, that was really something, huh?"
Yeah.
It's an interesting quote, because you've heard Lennon say the same thing. I don't know if it was closer to the end of 1980, but he said that we weren't, the leaders. We were just part of something. So he's echoing the same exact line that Bob is saying here. Yeah. So they're both on the same wavelength. We're not leaders of this generation. We're just part of it. So I like that they're both agreeing to that. Yeah. Just at different times they stated that.
I also think it's kind of a Lennon-esque quote in a way, where it starts off saying, "Do you see that? What John Lennon said? Oh my God, he was so out of control, absolutely crazy. But I love him." Which John did all the time.
Yeah.
I guess they're much more similar than we thought.
Yeah. And then I don't know if we might have even mentioned this last place, because I know here in my notes it jumps from that to 1974. But in December 71, obviously, Wings has their debut album, Wildlife, which Paul says was inspired by Bob's 1970 album, New Morning. And the quote that I got from him is, "I'd read that Bob Dylan had just made a quick album, and I really liked the idea, because we tended to take longer and longer to make records. The early albums by the Beatles hadn't taken long, and it seemed to me that Dylan was getting to that. I was a great admirer of his and still am to this day. So I thought, well, if it's good enough for him, let's do it. Which I think is fascinating. I would argue that, and I like Wildlife fine enough, but unlike Dylan with New Morning, I don't know if Paul necessarily had the songs for
Right.
Wildlife to justify the same process, but worth mentioning.
Well, it goes to show there are various ways of inspiring people. I mean, you could influence someone with the songwriting, or in this case, just taking a very short time to make an album gave Paul the idea to do the same thing. And sometimes people over the years, they like when Paul is more spontaneous and doesn't spend time laboring over and over and over with certain albums. And thankfully, we have all these decades of different approaches the way that Paul records, so we can judge what we like the best. Some people prefer Wildlife over Tug of War, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Or Run Devil Run.
Yeah. Well, there's that classic story of Paul talking about it in the was it Paul the Gambaccini interview where he says he was in LA and a guy went up to him with a cassette and held up Wildlife and said,
right.
"I'm going in the mountains, man. It's the best thing you've ever made."
Right.
Oh, Vic Garbarini. It was the Vic Garbarini interview. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd ever heard that. That's great.
Yeah.
Let's give that a listen. Yeah, because he says it.
That's the album that actually came out as a release on Columbia Records. Yeah.
Right.
1981, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I actually think I have a copy of that, and I thought I'd listened to it. I just didn't remember that story.
McCartney interview. Yeah.
Yeah. Black and white cover.
Yeah. Just want to mention March 24th, 1975, a party is held aboard the Queen Mary ocean liner in Long Beach, California, to celebrate the completion of Wings' Venus and Mars album. Dylan is in attendance, as is George Harrison. Very interesting. It's just nice to see that Dylan, there's a friendship with Paul as well. You tend to think of Dylan with Lennon and Harrison, not as much with Paul, I think.
And even
somebody
Ringo
said that. Even Ringo, somebody said that as a comment on our last episode. They said, "Well, this is just mainly about, Bob and George. What about the other Beatles?" Well, there wasn't too many instances where he got together with. So there's an instance.
Yeah, we got more.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about that '68 visit because it was important.
Right.
And, we ate up a chunk of time talking about it, but I'm glad we did. So, comments.
Right. Yeah. The thing is, it's you can't discount the long storied history and relationship of Dylan and Harrison, and then just from an influential standpoint, you have to talk about the Dylan Lennon connection. But we've got, assuming we get through all this, we've got quite a bit of Ringo and Paul talk coming up. And and I agree with Ken. It is nice to see Dylan there. And a couple weeks before that, on March 11th, Paul and Linda, Bob and his wife Sarah, and Greg Allman and Cher, they were at an after party in LA at the end of Rod Stewart and the Faces North American tour. So March 75, Bob and Paul saw a little bit of each other. And also, I guess if George was in attendance there, I know that Paul and Linda went to one of the Dark Horse shows in 74, but
it was a New York show though, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. So, but do we know any other time before that and then this in March 75 that Paul and George would have seen each other after the breakup, other than maybe court appearances?
When they signed,
when they were signing all the documents. Yeah.
And what was that not at the show in New York? Wasn't that after?
No, it was in I think it was the Plaza Hotel.
Yeah.
Got it. For some reason, I had it conflated in my head that was.
For the record, I don't know what I'm signing. This is another document. I don't know what I'm signing.
Right, and he goes,
So
"Lord,
good.
let this be final. Let this be final, please."
Yeah.
Paul's got the wing shirt on. Yeah.
And Paul looks so dejected, and George is just.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then John actually signed the contract in Disney World.
Disneyland.
Disney. Yeah.
Take those blank glasses off and get over here.
Didn't he send a balloon or something?
Yeah.
To the
That sounds right.
meeting? Yeah. Anyway, June of 75, in Rolling Stone, in an interview, journalist Pete Hamill asked John Lennon, "Is there anybody you'd like to produce? For example, Dylan." John responds, "Dylan would be interesting because I think he made a great album and blood on the tracks, but I'm still not keen on the backings. I think I could produce him great. You think that would ever have been a possibility, especially where, if John didn't do that semi-retirement for 5 years, even as a producer, not even talking about as a songwriter, writing with him?
I think convincing Dylan to have Lennon produce him would be quite a tall task.
Yeah.
Considering John's records were so densely produced anyway, listen to Mind Games. That's a densely produced record, Walls and Bridges.
He did work. Well, Walls and Bridges was made really quickly, and John did like to capture the moment, but they had such different working methods by all accounts. John was like about crafting singles, great records, and Dylan, the records weren't even that important to him, still aren't.
Well, there's so much on his albums that I wouldn't call singles with John.
Yeah.
But yeah, crafting it and developing it and in getting involved with the arrangement of it all. Yes, I could see that, but Dylan wasn't like that.
No. I mean, a lot of the, most of the stories are they're one take, two take, and he's not even, the bands aren't even really taught the songs very well. They maybe routine it once and then just put it down. And
Dylan is also notorious too for, at the drop of a hat saying, all right, let's do it in this key, or let's do it in this time signature. And I don't know, I'm just thinking of the 7, 8, 9 minute epics on some of Dylan's records. Like I'm picturing him showing John, Lily Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts, or Joey, or No Time to Think, and John just going, what do you want me to do with this? Both brilliant in their own rights, but and not even saying that it couldn't have been good, but I just think getting them in the same room together, like I said, tall task.
Yeah, that would have made John crazy, I think.
Oh yeah.
And he would have shown up once. Yeah, he would have shown up once. He said, "This is too weird," and he wouldn't have came back.
I mean, there's a great. So we, a couple of years ago, I worked on the Blood on the Tracks box, and I remember we had the raw tapes, and most of it came out on the box that, Mick Jagger stops by the studio and he's sort of suggesting things to Bob, and Bob is really snarky to him. He just has no interest in listening to what Mick Jagger says, so he's like, well, maybe you should put a slide guitar on this, Bob. And Bob's like, well, who's going to play that slide guitar? I mean, he's, you going to play that slide guitar? He's not, he's not open to ideas if he has and he has very clear ideas about where he wants to take his records. So I don't know that, not that he hasn't worked well with producers, but his best stuff, I think, has been when he stepped up or co-produced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jeff, having worked on that box set, what sessions do you enjoy the most out of that? Like, did you like what he did in New York first, or before he went back to Minnesota and redid it all? What do you prefer for that material?
Well, the interesting thing was when we listened, the story had always been that he went into the studio with a band and fired them one by one. And what we realized really quickly when we got the tapes up was that wasn't what happened, that he went into the studio and made essentially a completely acoustic record, just by himself. He cut, I think, 11 or 13 songs before the band even showed up, basically a whole record. So it's sort of freewheeling for 1974 kind of thing. And then Phil Ramone, we think, suggested these musicians, but the only people who were available were not like the top guys, because it was Rosh Hashanah and it was also short notice. So they got these guys who'd done the soundtrack for Deliverance, who were good players, but not really Bob Dylan caliber, or certainly, maybe the right guys for that. And so they did get the guys in, and they did, cut some tracks, but he got really irritated with the guy. I mean, he didn't give him much time to learn. They weren't properly mic'd, and they didn't have the right headphones. The drummer couldn't hear Bob. And I mean, there's a whole drama going on, but that was how he worked. And people like Jim Keltner or whoever else were used to that. They would just step in and do whatever Bob sort of needed. So he did sort of like whether it was literally or figuratively, the guys dropped off one by one till he was just left with the bass player. And then, over the course of the next couple of months, he had an acetate, and the record was coming out as just this acoustic record with a little bit of instrumentation, and it's available as a Record Store Day pressing now. And Pete Hamill wrote the liner notes for that version, which had different lyrics. And there were a couple of, there's an organ here and a slide guitar there, and not Mick Jagger, and bass, he went home for the holidays to Minnesota and hunkered down and listened to this, and the release date was set for January. And I think he realized, what we could surmise from the stories we all heard was that, it was a very competitive time in the singer-songwriter field. So at that moment, you had Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Neil Young, Jackson Browne, John. There were a lot of people who were occupying that space.
Zevon.
Well, not 70. This is
maybe not yet, not 74
right?
yet.
So Bob is a super competitive guy, and he wants to be number one. And he was looking at this record to be, I think, as a competitive guy, something that would leapfrog over all these people and say, sort of throw down the gauntlet and be like, look, you're all great, but I'm Bob Dylan. And so he, went in the studio and I guess recut 3 or 4 songs with really great guys in Minnesota, like really stellar, like the cream of the crop in Minnesota. And people can sort of laugh at that, but these are guys who played, jazz on the world stage and toured the world with big bands, and not big bands, but famous bands, and were really accomplished guys. And they did, Idiot Wind, Tangled Up in Blue, a couple others, and they, because those were interspersed in this otherwise acoustic record, it really elevated the record as a whole. So it gave you some breathing room from these, not dirges, but these sort of songs that started to all sound the same because they were all in open E tuning, and they had a sort of style to them and tone to them. People call it a breakup record or a love lost record. So I think the record as it came out is the record. That's what Bob intended. So the previous record, while it's cool, and for many years all the bootleg fans were like, well, that was what that should have come out, and that was, it's just not as good as an album. If you're trying to be number one, you're trying to make a number one record because you're Bob Dylan, and that's what you're always trying to do. Or certainly at that moment, the album that came out is the album that was going to be a number one record.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely ultimately prefer the New York recordings of Idiot Wind, Lily Rosemary, You're a Big Girl Now. But in the context of the record, it has to be.
They're cooler.
And it still sounds good. Can you confirm, Jeff? I don't know if you've heard this or if it's been confirmed, but what I've always heard is that it was Bob's brother who told him that he should go back and recut some of them with the band.
Well, I mean, that is the story. However, I don't think anybody tells Bob.
Well, sure.
No, and I say that not flippantly. What I mean is he had been living with that acetate for 4 months.
Sure.
So it wasn't like one person over Christmas said, hey, you know what you should do? But I do know that David, his brother David, was instrumental in helping him find local musicians in a studio in Minnesota, because Bob was not plugged into the Minnesota music scene. He borrowed a guitar and, all these things that you need to do to make a record. But I think that was something that, from what we unearthed in, correspondence and conversations he had with people around that time and immediately afterward, that it was something that was sort of percolating. Like this record's not a home run. How do I make it a home run? So it wasn't like one person was the fulcrum.
Well, it turned out so good that John Lennon said, it's good, but I don't like the backing tracks.
Right.
Weird.
Which were never important. It was, they were just sort of, he was always in a rush to finish the record.
It was a vehicle for the greater, song, the song,
right,
or whatever.
And to play them live.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the way that John Lennon worked, and he liked to work quickly in the studio. He didn't want to dwell too much on songs, and yet he did a lot of takes of his songs until he was happy with them anyway. So, let's move on to November of 1976. Dylan appears at The Last Waltz, and Ringo joins in on drums for I Shall Be Released. Final performance of the band, obviously. Several years later, in his audio diary, Lennon remarks of Dylan's most recent single, Gotta Serve Somebody. Guess he wants to be a waiter now.
Oh, incredible.
And we know that John made several recordings of his parody of Gotta Serve Somebody, Serve Yourself, which is hysterical, I think. But I love the one where he's playing the acoustic guitar and singing to Sean and cursing, a bit in the song there, wash your ears, all this other stuff. But what is your take on, is he just having a laugh with this and that's just it? Why did Dylan have to go the religious route? And did it bother him really, or just?
I think John, on some level, was a little bit of jealous, just slightly, a little bit.
I do. Just because of the success that Bob was having with Slow Train.
Yeah.
It's a great. I mean, that is a record in Dylan's catalog that sounds great. It was, recorded really well. Jerry Wexler produced it. It was a great band. Jim Keltner again. Just an amazing group of guys, and people derived that trilogy of records, the gospel period, and now they've come around because the music on it, if you can sort of set aside the sermonizing and proselytizing from the live concerts, the performances, I mean, Dylan was really invested as a performer and a singer in those concerts, and the records are just really, really well made pop records. So, I mean, he performed on the Grammys, and John saw it, and took umbrage at the, John was never one to suffer fools. So I think it was easy to mock Dylan, right, for John.
Well, and I think too, we've talked so much, they both sort of have this, mindset of, well, we didn't ask to be, the voice of a generation. We didn't ask to be the leaders. And John has always seen Dylan as kind of this cosmic brother. And now it's like, oh, wait, well, now he's being a preacher. Like that's the, complete antithesis, even though, again, John had done similar things
sometime in New York City.
Exactly. So everyone's a hypocrite, or not even a hypocrite, we all contain multitudes. I just think that at this point in time, whether there was some jealousy involved, like Andy said, or just sort of, and we know from the same audio diary that, John for about 3 days was interested in potentially becoming a born again Christian, by listening to Billy Graham. And then I don't think anything actually came of that. But, I think that, again, John saw what was happening and had a lot of feelings of it.
And he was Bob, had a good hit with Gotta Serve Somebody. I mean, it's a great, as Jeff says, it's a great record. I mean, for my money, Precious Angel and I Believe in You.
Oh, yeah.
Those are two of the best songs ever.
I do wonder about the jealousy aspect, because I remember John talking about, that he's more an adult now around the time of Double Fantasy, and, he's not into like teenagers following him, go follow the Rolling Wings, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you wonder, when he's saying that, is he jealous of the fact that Paul is still out there, having hit records and still having a following like that?
They're all super competitive guys. I mean, it's always love-hate. And they're taking inspiration from the other guy's success. It's the I'm going to write Penny Lane, you're going to write Strawberry Fields, whatever instigates the inspiration. And John, I think John needed, not in some ways a foil, and in other ways an enemy, a frenemy, something to kind of rail against, to kind of get his get the vim and vigor up and kind of do the work, because he was, by his own account, a pretty lazy guy, and I think most rock and rollers are.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward a little bit at the timeline that I have. So in September 1980, David Sheff from Rolling Stone interviews Lennon. That's eventually published, obviously posthumously, in January 81, and he mentions Bob kind of in passing a few times, but then at one point he quotes Subterranean Homesick Blues, and Sheff says, so you're quoting one of your peers of sorts, is it distressing to you that Dylan is a born-again Christian? And John says, I don't like to comment on it. For whatever reason he's doing it, it's personal for him and he needs to do it. But the whole religion business suffers from the onward Christian soldiers bit. There's too much talk about soldiers and marching and converting. I'm not pushing Buddhism because I'm no more a Buddhist than I am a Christian. But there's one thing I admire about the religion. I can never pronounce this word correctly. There's no proselytizing. Yeah. I stopped listening to Dylan with both ears after he says Highway 64 and Blonde on Blonde. And even then it was because George would sit me down and make me listen. So yeah, I think that, John probably had a lot of opinions on it, but to answer your original question, Ken, I think that some degree of it was him having fun, taking the piss out of Dylan, and maybe with a little bit of, seriousness thrown in there.
All right, let's move on a bit. In 1981, Dylan records Heart of Mine with Ringo on drums, eventually released on Shot of Love in August of 81. Yeah. I actually, I like the drumming on that song, especially towards the end. It's kind of really strong.
I think Ringo and Keltner are on that track.
I believe.
And one of the best tracks on that record. It's not as good as the live version that came out on Biograph a few years later, but still really, really good. And yeah, I guess 1981, the first time that they're finally on a studio album, was a conjoining of Dylan with at least one of the Beatles. That's pretty cool.
The last of the religious albums.
Mm-hmm. Which, right? And even Shot of Love is kind of like half and half.
Half and half, yeah. Not really.
But yeah, Heart of Mine's killer tune. Heart of Mine, great melody on that tune.
Yeah. All right. Here's one thing, one of the few, Dylan, that you didn't mention. George made a demo for the song Abandon Love. And this was sometime between 1983 and 85. I love the recording, which has been bootlegged for many years. And great from what I understand, that was supposed to be on Desire, and decided to leave it off.
Should have been on Desire.
Yeah, it's one of those great lost songs. Yeah.
So there's almost every album. There's at least one song where you're like, dude,
really, dude, Fine with McCall.
Really? And usually at least one song where you're like, you could have taken that one off. Look, Joey, fine enough song, but take Joey off of Desire and put Abandoned Love on, and it's a 10 out of 10 instead of a 9.9 out of 10. But yeah, totally forgot about George's Abandoned Love. So good catch, Ken.
So how did it wind up that George recorded it? Is it the same thing as I Don't Want to Do It? The same situation?
Yeah, I'm not totally, Jeff?
No, I mean, it was a song that was floating around that people had heard. I really don't know.
Yeah,
but now I'm going to look to find out.
Okay.
I mean, come on, you got access to that their place in Oklahoma. Well, I guess Oklahoma.
I just came back from Oklahoma. I'm not going there again for a while, but I would be curious. I am curious.
There's something I wanted to bring up, and I know I've talked about this with Jeff. And when you listen to a song like Abandoned Love, and so many of these other songs that George did of Dylan's, he is just so right at home with Dylan songs. It's like he belongs there. He should have made a whole Dylan album. It's just, especially George with acoustic guitar doing Dylan songs. So what is it about him in particular? I don't know why. It's just...
I think, honestly, it's because people don't value Bob enough as a melodist. And, I'm not going to say necessarily, like, when you think of the all-time great melodic songwriters, obviously you think of Lennon, McCartney, Brian Wilson, Tom Petty, so on and so forth.
Elton.
Elton, okay,
I think of George.
Yeah, well, you think of George, exactly. But, and like, yeah, maybe you don't think of Bob Dylan's a top 10. And I think some of that also gets, again, conflated with people not necessarily valuing Dylan as a vocalist, but Dylan has written so many incredible melody. The melody to Abandoned Love is a great melody. And, Mommy, You've Been on My Mind, and I Don't Want to Do It. Like, they're great songs. They fit really well within George's range. And, George is such a great singer, and he knows his way around these melodies really well. So, that's what I would say.
He's a great interpreter. And I think, it sometimes takes somebody like George or the Byrds or, even Peter, Paul and Mary to sort of, pull out what's best about a song and show you, shine a new light on it. So, when George was on Rockline, any time he had a guitar in his hands, he was playing Bob Dylan songs, and they were always great. He was really invested in those. He really loved Bob's music. And I think that was, he sort of aspired. It wasn't competitive because I don't think George held himself in the same regard as Dylan, who would as a songwriter. So it was aspirational. He would, I've had this conversation. I write about this in the liner notes for the More Blood, More Tracks box set, that I would have these conversations when I was working with Pete Townsend about many of the artists he was around in the 60s and 70s. And he would talk about two artists like they were something else. Like if he talked about John or Paul or the Kinks or whoever it was, they were peers. But when he talked about Hendrix and when he talked about Dylan, he held them in a higher regard than the other guys. They were up here.
Yeah. Understandably so.
Okay. I think we'll have some fans here who might put the Beatles above, but we all are entitled to our opinions.
But they were guys, you got to understand, they were guys who were grinding it out at the same time he was, doing the same things, playing the same clubs,
Okay, I see from that point of view, yeah.
Yeah. They were collegial. And even if they're, they were, the Beatles are the Beatles. I don't think he had any delusion about his place in the hierarchy. But I also think that, I can't speak for him because it was a really long time ago too. But I think that he would regard, sort of a Kinks song or a Lennon and McCartney song or some of these other things, certainly then when, we didn't have the same passage of time as, pop songs for the radio. And that Dylan's songs were more canonical. They were sort of songs that are going to last for hundreds of years. And the Beatles, now we can see that the Beatles records and the Beatles story is probably going to last forever. But, when was this, 91 or 92, it kind of felt like they were great pop records from the 60s in some ways. Not all of us felt that way. You and I certainly didn't, Ken. But, I get it. Whereas Hendrix felt like, I remember him talking about it was like an alien who came down and was just there for a moment and disappeared, because he was that unique and special.
And knowing how much, Townsend values the art of, guitar playing, of course, you could argue that what Hendrix did for, guitar playing is what Dylan did for the art of, songwriting or lyricism or whatnot. So that makes a ton of sense to me that Townsend would value those guys like that.
And yet he was still bitter that Jimmy stole the. He was asked.
He's always bitter about something.
So at one point, Hendrix was on the Who's label, Track Records, and his manager Chris Stamp said, "Hey, take him down to get some of those great amps you have." So he had these big Marshall stacks, which did not exist. Jim Marshall would make them, right? And so he took Hendrix down there, and then Pete had 2, and the next time he saw Hendrix had 4. And he was like, he's been bitter ever since about that. So anyway.
Interesting conversation here. But getting back to the whole idea about pop music for its time, you go back to the Beatles days. Oh, every artist, I think they were all kind of trained to think that this was all just, you know, the pop music for the moment, and it didn't have any longevity. And that's how most artists felt
True.
about their stuff. Nobody
Sure.
could see into the future. None of us could. You know?
I think Dylan just had his kind of overall ethos is like, I'm going to do my thing and they're doing theirs, and that's cool. You know?
Yeah. I think, but I also don't think it's an accident that, you know, when not at all to imply that, you know, the Beatles didn't take anything seriously before Rubber Soul, because obviously they did. But, you know, around that, you know, 1965, you know, they start taking the art of making the album, you know, a cohesive unit, even more seriously than they ever had before. And then that turns, you know, into influencing Pet Sounds and so on and so forth. And Dylan was a big part of that too. So, you know, all those guys are so instrumental. You know, if you kind of view 1965 as the turning point, you know, both within the industry and even just, you know, society as a whole, you know, viewing pop music not just as, you know, this fun, cute little, you know, background noise of life, but as like something capable of making a true artistic statement. You know, I don't know. I just think that's something interesting to think about. Or to consider.
And I would also say Dylan was, and you know, not to go back to the 60s, because we certainly have plenty ahead of us, but I would say, you know, Dylan's records and those records from 65 to 66 and even Freewheelin' before that were far more influential on what the Beatles were doing in the mid 60s than Pet Sounds of the Beach Boys. I mean, Pet Sounds of the Beach Boys, it's a great record, and you know, there's no debating that, but it doesn't, I mean, it's not, the Beatles were pushed sonically, but not lyrically. I mean, you know, Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, there's no poppier band in pop music than Brian Wilson, and they're I'm not going to swear, a barbershop quartet, right? So that they're just a glorified rock and roll, not rock and roll. They're a barbershop quartet. That's, you know, but the Beatles were getting serious about making serious records, serious music, having, you know, a message in them that wasn't just Moon and June and I Love You. And the Beach Boys, by all accounts, never got off that. And I like them fair enough. And I've spent some quality time with Brian Wilson, but I think the whole, you know, deifying Brian Wilson does a disservice both to him.
Even this, and you're going to discount the Smile? You're going to discount the Smile stuff though, Jeff?
Yeah, I am, because it didn't come out for 50 years. So, you know, I mean, I saw it when he did it live at the Royal Festival Hall, and it was mind-blowing and special. And that wasn't going to, I mean, let's be serious. Smile was not going to compete in any meaningful way with Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. It's kind of half an idea that's all over the place and an acid mess. You know, it's just, you know, he's the poster child for mental health awareness at that point. So, and he, you know, and he can't write a lyric. So it's like, he wasn't the model for the Beatles, right? So Dylan, I know we're going to get lots of comments, but this, you know, this is, I've written about this a lot. I've written about the Beach Boys. I've interviewed Brian, spent quality time with him. He's, you know, hard, and it's hard to do. It's hard to interview Brian, as anybody who's done it will tell you. But I think, and I love those records. I've been to the tours and I've seen them, and you know, but there's also something, you know, there's a great line from Liam Gallagher. It's like, you know, nobody would even remember the Beach Boys if they weren't next to the Beatles in the record bins. And I think that's really, you know, there's some truth to that.
Wow, we can go in a lot of directions here with that, but you know, I also remember hearing that Pet Sounds was a much bigger album at the time in the UK than it was here in the US. So it influenced a lot of British artists at the time, much more so than here. It didn't chart as well. It was a big disappointment, actually, in how it charted when it first came out. But I think that, yes, sonically, it was an influence on the Beatles. But, and the thing is, with Pet Sounds, I never really hear anybody other than Paul talk about it in the Beatles.
No, if you go back to the Beatles book, you know, the sort of the Beatles Monthly that used to come out at that time, there were the reporters who spent time with them in the studio and talked to them for 5 minutes to get, you know, little blurbs, or Mal or whoever wrote it up. they were listening to Pet Sounds, and George and John both talk about Pet Sounds. I mean,
Okay,
it was certainly on their minds, but no more than Whiter Shade of Pale. I mean, that was certainly a huge record to them, and very influential sonically. But I mean, I think I'm trying to find a nice way to say this, but there's no more conservative band than the Beach Boys, right? With the striped shirts and the whole, they never got off that very, very conservative America flag wavy thing. And that was never the Beatles, and it was never Bob.
Well, they tried to. It was rejected. They tried to.
Because for all the fans who want them to be, and I'm not saying Dennis was amazing, and they had some moments in the '70s and all that.
You got some people that think Sunflower is like their Sgt. Pepper.
Yes, that is true. And there are also people who think Big Star made Sgt. Pepper. So it's like I mean, everybody it's music. It gets to be that to whoever listens to it, and God love him for it. And I don't want to deride, Carl particularly as a talent, and because that was a great record, but their catalog is patchy at best, and great AM friendly radio music that was, for a different kind of person than was listening to the Beatles as the Beatles progressed as a band.
Fair.
Well, I would add
we're way off topic, and I'm going to get hate mail because I always get the hate mail.
Let me just take a few seconds to say here that I know that Paul has talked about, in particular, the bass playing that's on Pet Sounds, and that Brian Wilson didn't always play the root of the chord, and that was an influence on him. There are times when I will hear a song like,
and it was also Carol Kay most of the time, but that's okay.
Right. Well,
right.
That's right. But that's what he heard in the record anyway. But
Dylan is
I'm waiting for the day. I'm waiting for the day whenever I hear that instrumental in the middle there. Paul used that and let him in.
Oh yeah.
I can hear an influence there, definitely. And there's some odd chord progressions in certain songs on Pet Sounds. Don't Talk is an amazing song. I could easily hear the Beatles being influenced by something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sonically, compositionally, absolutely.
To tie it back to where we kind of were before we went into this spiral hole of Beach Boys.
My fault.
No, it's okay. But we glossed over the fact that in George's book, which came out in 1980, the only record he says that he brought with him to India was Blonde on Blonde, which he said in the My book, bringing it back, circling it back to the Beatles and Bob.
Right.
Then, which I did not know until I looked at your notes.
Didn't take Pet Sounds with him.
All right. Let's move on to 1987. This is going to be a 5-part series.
They did take Mike Love with them, so they need.
February 19th. I remember hearing about this when it happened. Harrison and Dylan are both in the house band for Taj Mahal's gig at Palomino Club in Los Angeles. George is present for the whole set and sings on a medley of Carl Perkins songs, Matchbox and Gone, 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 Honey Don't, a cover of Watching the River Flow, Peggy Sue and Dizzy Miss Lizzie. Bob joins the band on guitar from Matchbox, playing for the rest of the set, contributing occasional background vocals and singing co-lead vocals with George on Peggy Sue. John Fogerty and Jesse Ed Davis also were present there. Man, I'd love to see a real clear copy of that.
Yeah, so
Jesse Ed, that had to be towards the end. Wow.
Yeah. What were we going to say, Jeff?
Well, I interviewed John Fogerty.
Of course you did. Of course you interviewed John Fogerty.
August or September, and then got to spend quite a bit of time with him.
At Thanksgiving dinner with him.
Sort of off the
Christmas
record.
Morning. Yeah.
Wrote a song with him.
We went to see him in Atlantic City, and then we hung out with the family in his suite afterwards, as you do. Anyway, you're going to make me name drop. I'm going to do it. But we talked about that, and he told us great, because I don't know how Bob came up, but we were talking about Dylan, and he said it was really funny because that was at a point where John was not playing CCR songs. He just would not play them, and I saw him around that time, and it was it was hard going. It was still great. He's still a great guitar player, great singer, but they were challenging shows, to say the least. And he said, he said, he said at one point they were playing something. George was singing, and Bob leaned over and said, "Let's play Proud Mary next." And he goes, "Oh, Bob, I don't do those songs." He goes, "But it's Proud Mary." And he goes, "Yeah, but I don't play Proud Mary anymore." And he goes, "Well, people are going to think it's a Tina Turner song if you don't play it." And he said, there was something about the sort of bluntness about this guy who's written a lot of great songs, knowing that if somebody else starts to own your song, it becomes associated with them. You sort of lose your connection to that song. So that was what sort of spurred him to start playing CCR songs again.
Interesting.
Yeah,
From
I
this
think
one
Bob.
show.
I think if Bob Dylan,
it was worth the wait.
Yeah, I think if Bob Dylan tells you something
To
like
do
that, A, you do it, and B, it tells you like, well, if this guy wants to hear me sing it, that means he must really value this song. And if he values this song, there has to be something to that.
Right.
So we can thank him for that. And it really wasn't until the late 90s, when Fogerty went out on tour and was consistently playing them, throughout the whole set. But yeah, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, you finally he would show up at something and he might do a song or two. And it was like, oh, great. He's not playing Zans Can't Dance. He's actually playing, a real song.
A real song. I've seen John a few times in concert. He's phenomenal.
He's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Voice is still great. Guitar playing is great.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Yeah. All right. April of 87. Ringo records an album in Memphis with Chips Moman.
Right.
And there's actually a song in there that Bob wrote for the album, and he plays harmonica on it, called Wish I Knew Now What I Knew Then, which has been bootlegged. I think it's a pretty good song, actually.
Yeah.
It's a shame that we didn't get to hear, even though I think Ringo is embarrassed by the sessions because he had his drinking problem at the time, and he did whatever he could to prevent the release of the Chips Moman album. But apparently there was like 2 albums worth of material that was recorded, and only 5 of them that I know of have been bootlegged, and that's one of them, that song.
Yeah. I'm glad that you guys think it's good. I don't think it's a particularly strong song, and I don't think that Ringo, or because Bob sings and plays harmonica on it too, and I don't think that Bob or Ringo sound particularly strong vocally on it. And this Bob's voice for me between 78 and 87, 88 is like my quote unquote least favorite. And there's a lot of stuff within that time period that he sings that I think is great, but between Street Legal and Down in the Groove, he got very nasally and very shouty. And this is like the peak of the nasally Bob, and having
Dylan,
that up against.
I want a 10,000 word essay on Brownsville Girl in a week.
Yeah, Dansville Girl.
Yeah, New Danville Girl. Yeah, Brownsville Girl is the most curiously overhyped song in Dylan's catalog. New Danville
crazy.
Girl.
That song is damn good.
We're not going there. And I also I'm really happy that you guys had so much to say in the Beach Boys, because my Beach Boys opinions would get me killed if I started talking about them. But yeah, hearing Dylan.
Oh, I was being kind.
Yeah, hearing Dylan in his full nasal shout up against Ringo's, I don't know, I don't want to say lazy vocal, but it's not Ringo. To me,
it sounds like a demo. It sounds like a demo.
It sounds like a demo. To me, you definitely hear a lot of rejuvenation in Ringo's voice, during both the All-Star Band Time Takes Time. For me, it's Vertical Man, where he really, I think, between Vertical Man and Why Not is like the strongest that his voice maybe ever sounded. I just don't think it's a great song, but I'm glad that you guys like it.
I would encourage you to listen to the gospel albums again. I think Dylan's singing, particularly live, was fantastic during that period.
No, there are
the 80s though, Empire Burlesque, and the recent box set shows that he could do it, but you're right, live, sure. He wasn't.
Yeah, no, there are so many songs between 78 and 88 that he did, but between live recordings, album cuts, outtakes, that are fantastic. Just in general, it's not my favorite era of his voice. But.
Okay. Well, Dylan, you and I have to do a show on Time Takes Time very soon. And I mean, to me, that was the big comeback for him when everything kind of changed.
I'll listen to that.
Okay. You can join in anytime you want, Jeff. 1987, of course, the big year for Cloud 9 coming out. And there is a reference to a Bob Dylan song on the album, which Dylan didn't put in his notes here. From When We Was Fab, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue.
Oh, yeah.
And as Jeff was mentioning earlier, George appeared on Rockline to promote Cloud 9 with Jeff Lynne. And they did
highly inebriated too, I think.
It sure sounded like it.
A little bit.
Yeah. So George performed Every Grain of Sand. He quoted All Along the Watchtower, and also Mr. Tambourine Man. So he's got a guitar in hand. He's going to be doing Dylan.
Yeah. And it's
a great version of Every Grain of Sand.
It is. And
truly beautiful version.
And let it be known too that writing 13 pages of notes just for Ken Michaels to tell you that you missed something is just about the most deflating feeling in the world. So just, a warning message to anyone out there who might be on the show. Just know that Ken is a very thankless and ungracious host.
Oh my God.
I've been praising you on this channel so many times already.
I kid.
No, really.
You really think about the Beach Boys.
Yeah, I'm projecting because I'm upset that I missed, because I knew he did Every Grain of Sand. I don't know how I missed that here. But.
Yeah, I was just remembering that, but the one omission that was glaring to me was Abandon Love.
Glaring. See, there he goes again. Glaring. Dylan the mess up over here.
January of 1988, the Beatles and Bob Dylan are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And Dylan, Harrison, and Ringo all attend to accept their inductions and play in the house band for the closing ceremonies. Among the songs they performed, Twist and Shout, All Along the Watchtower, I Saw Her Standing There, and Like a Rolling Stone.
And, just to really put a bow on it, Beach Boys also inducted that year. You get really gracious speeches from Brian and Carl, and then Mike Love comes on stage. Ooh. And being Mike Love decides to completely torpedo the whole thing, goes off on a rant about how he's the friggin' king of rock and roll, and how the Beatles and Stones are nothing. And then Dylan has his acceptance speech and almost immediately says, "I want to thank Mike Love for not mentioning me in his speech."
Great.
And then after I forget what the exact quote is, but he says something like, "Oh, well, the Stones aren't doing anything, and the Beach Boys are doing this, and Mick Jagger's too chicken blank to come up and sing with the Beach Boys." And then later on in the night during this jam, Mick Jagger's there, they're playing Satisfaction, and you see Mike Love trying to sing with him and get into it, and Mick is just like, "Nope, I'll hang with Springsteen, a real artist, while you be Mike Love next to me."
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna get hate mail from Beach Boys fans on this show.
I think Mike Love is pretty universally reviled, except for he has his faction, but it's okay. The Mike Love John Stamos Beach Boys is not like a beloved version of the Beach Boys. The people who really love the Beach Boys are the Sunflower, Pet Sound.
Yes.
Smiley Smile,
Mike's got the California saga on Holland, which is great. There's select things here and there, but he's a terrible person, and most of all the worst parts of the Beach Boys come from Mike Love. And I don't care if we get hate mail about that. No, we should talk about.
We're in 100% agreement.
Yeah, and we should talk about we're being so hateful right now. Why don't we talk about something extremely positive that happened on April 3rd, 1988?
Let's do that.
Wilburys, baby.
Oh, okay. Oh, you didn't put that in here.
Yes,
what?
I did.
Oh, okay, you didn't. Oh, I'm
right there.
No, you just said 1988. Right, okay,
that's exactly what he just said.
No, it didn't have April. Anyway,
that's right. I'm looking at it right
now.
Okay. So, Traveling Wilburys. What a surprise that was. And being on the radio at the time doing my Beatles show, I remember hearing reports about this happening, and I was so completely shocked. Mainly because of the combination of those 5 people, and obviously 5 incredible talents. But my immediate reaction really had more to do with the vocals and thinking, Bob Dylan and Roy Orbison in the same band? You couldn't find 2 people more different vocally, you know. But what a pleasant surprise it was, because when it did come out, it was a lot of fun. It was all about fun. It was not taking yourself seriously, and just having one really good rock and roll song after another. And even just watching them in their videos, it's so much fun to see them, and in their interviews, how they take everything so lightly and dust everything off, and you know, they don't take themselves seriously. They're just there to have some fun. And what a breath of fresh air it was when it came out.
The Wilburys thing. Go ahead, Jeff.
No. Go ahead. Because
I was just going to say, that was I was about 7 when that came out, and I was my first time I ever saw Bob Dylan. I didn't know anything about. I saw him. Like, oh, some famous guy from the '60s. I knew who the Beatles were. I was a young Beatle fan. I'm like, who's that guy with him? That's Bob Dylan. That was my first introduction to Bob Dylan. Was the Wilburys, and probably was for a lot of other people who may not have been exposed to him by that supergroup coming together at that time. Maybe it was for me.
I just want to point out too that, you know, we all know the sort of the version of how they came together that George told many times over the years. But the really interesting thing was Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty were making a record which became Full Moon Fever in Mike Campbell's garage. And I think it was, I have to remember, I don't remember the days exactly, but on the first day, they wrote You're So Bad and Free Fallin'. On the second day, they wrote Handle with Care. They wrote I Won't Back Down. On the third day, they had a session with Roy and wrote You Got It with George in attendance. And on the last day, they all met up at Bob's house and helped out on Handle with Care. So in that 5-day period, I mean, anybody, that's a career for most artists. And those 2 guys were instrumental in those 4 or 5 records that sort of changed rock and roll, the trajectory of rock and roll, that went back to a rootsier sound, a more songwritery sound, you know, a real rock and roll sound in a way that it hadn't been. It had been very, you know, up to 1988, 89 was really barren. I mean, the only rock and roll records that were being made were like Keith Richards' solo records. We weren't getting much by way of.
Well, I mean, you can't discount the, you know, REM, the Replacements, the whole college scene. You know, it's a totally different thing.
I actually can, but that's a whole other. That's another.
This period. No, I want to say, Jeff, this period that you're talking about is recounted so well in the Jeff Lynne documentary, Mr. Blue Sky by Danny Harrison, about Full Moon Fever and Tom Petty's. That period is so wonderfully retold, because you got to see the footage of them rehearsing and all that stuff for the first time on that documentary, which was just incredible.
Yeah, and one of the things we had when I did the book with Roy's sons, we had access to Roy's notes from the time and his wife Barbara's notes from the time. And so we were able to like pinpoint the dates of when things happened and how things went down and sort of the trajectory of the Wilburys. And in the Dylan Center, I saw I took a screenshot of a note from George to Bob on Wilbury Weekly letterhead, handwritten. He wrote it, and it's just, you know, I won't read the whole thing because it's got a couple of drawings by George, and it's basically he sent him a cassette of the rough mixes of the album, and he's like apologizing, like, we haven't added vocals to this yet, and don't worry, we're going to change this, and we haven't put the solos on yet, but it's basically, you know, just a letter from one musician to another saying, this is where we're at right now, I hope you like it. It's very cool.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that record. I just think it is so. It's
and
so
I love
fun.
Volume 3 as well. I mean, I really do.
Honestly, it's. I think it's. You know, it's not as maybe magical as the first one. No. It doesn't have the story behind it, but there's a lot of really good songs on it. I mean, Bob was a part of 2 albums that came out in 1990, Under the Red Sky and Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. And one is very good and one is not
so much. Yeah, but I think it could be salvaged by better production. But I will say give it a shot. Give it a shot again.
I have many times, but
you know, the interesting thing about Volume 3, and I know I'm jumping ahead, is they only had Dylan for a week before he went on tour. So they basically went in and slammed out all the songs and had Bob do vocals for all the songs, and then went in and sort of dropped in the rest of them, and sort of, you know, added a couple of additional songs. So, you know, it's a little more of a hodgepodge, and yet it's still incredibly, it's just artistically an incredibly successful record. Yeah. It is very much sort of the next iteration of the Wilburys, you know, minus Roy, obviously, who had died right on the cusp of you know, those records going to #1 and platinum and all those other things. But yeah, they're, you know, it's a really rocking record too. Yeah. And Jim Keltner plays the refrigerator, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah. And that's recorded in April 1990. Like you said, they had to do all that before Dylan went out on tour. And even before that, you know, right before those sessions is basically when all of Under the Red Sky was recorded, which we should mention. George plays slide guitar on the title track, which at its core, I don't think is a very good song, but it is a nice arrangement, and the slide sounds great on it. So yeah.
Yeah. Also, Gary Moore, he was on Volume 3.
She's My Baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
guitar playing on that.
You know, we probably just talked for whatever 5-10 minutes on the Wilburys. We could, you know, they could
do a whole episode.
Talked about
exactly.
You know, there's still
we didn't even
more
talk about Tweeter and the Monkey Man yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I mean, you could talk, you know, so much about, you know, what the other three, you know, Orbison, Petty, and Lynn, what they mean to it. You know, we have so much more we need to talk about, but you know, it is such a magical thing that it happened at all to begin with, and you know, maybe very, very few of the songs are these huge artistic statements or poetic masterpieces, but you know, it's such a fun, upbeat record. I still love it.
Well, it's a snapshot of a moment in time that you know, none of us could ever imagine would have happened.
Yeah.
The serendipity
the best things
of it
in life
all.
always happen to, you know, a happy accident, right? It's usually how the best things are like that.
That's why I was going to say serendipity. You know, it just so happens Jeff Lynne was working with most of these people at the same time. Yeah. And and it's great to see Roy Orbison connecting again with George Harrison after his past with the Beatles when they toured together, all of that. So
almost 30 years later. Yeah.
Is there any truth? You know, you always hear rumors that after Roy died, they were going to try and get Del Shannon to be in the Wilburys, and Carl Perkins was supposed to be a consideration. You know, I
asked Tom Petty point blank, and he said not a shred of truth.
Yeah,
because they were never going to replace. They actually asked on Volume 1 for McGuinn to stop by and do a solo. I think that's where the rumors kind of kicked off, and of course Petty had worked with Del Shannon, had a long relationship with him. They did run away, so you know, and I think there was, you know, Clapton. There were a lot of people who were talked about, but Roger was on tour and couldn't make the session, so he just wasn't on the record. And it was Volume 1, not Volume 3. But I asked, you know, I asked Roy's sons, I asked Danny, I asked Petty directly, I asked Jeff Lynne. They all said absolutely not. Like not like they're fudging it or anything. It was like just never even considered.
Do we even know at the time? Because Tom produced Del's '82 album, and during those sessions took Del's bassist. You know, so at that time,
Epstein,
so Ron Blair was the original bassist in the Heartbreakers. He left after the Heart Promises record, and then, or maybe did one song for Long After Dark. He left, and this is when Petty was working with Del, and there's that great quote in Running Down a Dream, you know, where Petty's recounting Del telling him, like, Tom, you can do whatever you want, but don't take Howie. And Petty says, Del, I love you, I'm taking Howie.
Right.
So, but do we know if they were on okay terms after that?
I think they were on okay terms. They all worked together later. I think Jeff Lynne and Del Shannon worked later, but I think, you know, Del was, and anybody will tell you this, I'm not speaking out of school, Del was not a well man. No, and the thing about the Wilburys was it was the serendipity thing. It was 5 guys who came together by happenstance, you know? And you can't just throw, Eric Clapton in the mix and have it work, or Roger McGuinn, or Del Shannon, or whoever. It was easier for them to just move on without a fifth member than to just get a random person because maybe the record company wanted them to.
Yeah.
But they were like flat out denied. It was just like no truth. And I asked Roger. I mean, he was the one who told me the story about being asked to be on the session for the first record and just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Do you think they knew after they finished Volume 3 that was it, or was there any chance that there was going to be another album?
There was always a chance. I mean, I think it was Tom Petty. It might have been Jeff Lynne told me that he always felt Any Road was written for the Wilburys. There were songs that felt like, by all of them, a lot of Highway Companion, which Tom Petty made with Jeff Lynne, has a Wilbury feel to it. Some of the songs,
I could even hear some of those Wildflowers. Like I hear songs
absolutely.
like a higher place. That could have been a Wilbury song easily.
Right. So there were, but getting motivating George, you got to remember what happened in George's life after the Volume 3. So he went on the road, he did the shows with Clapton, came back to find that his business manager had lost all his money, basically, and was in litigation with that guy for a very long time, but essentially went from having roughly $200 or $300 million to having no $1 million, right? And
are you telling me he was totally broke?
The only reason, the way I understand it, the only reason George acquiesced to doing Anthology was because he was promised $450 million.
Needed the money because his manager was Dennis O'Brien, who ripped him off.
Yeah.
I was also promised,
and it shows he ripped him off.
I was also promised $450 million for appearing on this show. So, it just goes to show you what
and it's funny when you watch George on the Anthology, like for somebody that needed to do it, he still was not going to be cheery and go, "Oh, this is great." No. I have not great memories about this, and I'm going to be honest and tell you that some of that was not enjoyable.
I felt that was a really good experience for George in that he was able to be George, but because John wasn't there, I think he felt an obligation to also be a little bit John, a little bit, not just be funny and George and wry, but be a little sardonic, a little mean here and there. And I think it really balanced things off well. And I think, he became that John George hybrid for sort of the rest of his life. And I loved it. I thought it was great.
Yeah. It's like, well, I need to do this to have money, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it and pretend and put a show on for you.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Ken?
This is really hard for me to believe. Not that George lost a lot of money, but if he hadn't shown up for the Beatles Anthology, he would have looked really bad.
Well, they wouldn't have done it without it. That's the thing.
But I would think he'd want to tell his side of the story no matter what.
And it wouldn't have happened. That's the point. There wouldn't have been a Beatles Anthology if they weren't all involved. That was always the agreement. That's why it took so long for it to happen. It was just, again, serendipitous that the timing was sort of at the moment of Britpop and the next generation of listeners coming in. CDs, were better distributed, and there were new compilations and new remastering coming in. It was like a lot of things happened all at once.
But we also know that Anthology, in some ways was in the works for over 20 years in one way or another. It just,
30,
obviously, the long and winding road. I also
if George was going to be involved, it wasn't going to be called that.
Well, yeah, and those are the other two stipulations, that if George Martin isn't going to produce these new songs, it's Jeff Lynne or bust, and it's not going to be the title of a Lennon McCartney song. It's going to be something neutral.
Right. And Eric Idle told me that for the Ruddles, he went to Apple when it was still there in the mid-70s and watched a cut of The Long and Winding Road, which he said was only about 2 hours long. It was, he remembered it as sort of being similar to Beatles Complete, the movie, the sort of VHS movie we all had in the 80s. But that it was, really rough and thrown together and chop, 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 it wasn't smooth at all, but it had the arc of this story that shocked him, how perfect the beginning, middle, and end was. And that was where the Ruddles came from.
Yeah. Well, not to
we're way off again.
Yeah. Well, but before we move on, because we already talked about Under the Red Sky in Volume 3, but I do just want to mention, obviously, Ringo gets sober in the late 80s and embarks on the first All-Star Band tour. The first date of that is July 23rd, 1989. But a month before, June 13th, he, for whatever reason, is in France when Bob is there and joins Bob and the band on stage. They set up a second drum kit, and Ringo's there playing on Highway 61 Revisited and Like a Rolling Stone. And there's footage of that on YouTube that people should go check out. And it's just it's a blast to see Ringo on stage playing those tunes.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
But shall we fast forward to October 16th, 1992?
I think so.
30th. Yeah, that's the biggie.
30th anniversary of Bob Dylan's first record. And the big show at Madison Square Garden where George Harrison performs. I got to tell you, his performance of Absolutely Sweet Marie, one of my favorite live performances from any of the Beatles.
It's great.
Just like I said, he's so right at home with Dylan music, and the band's
it's kind of we talked about how Dylan had more of an influence maybe on what the Beatles were doing than the opposite way around, and that may be true. But Absolutely Sweet Marie, kind of a jangly Beatle-y song if you think about it to begin with. So it makes sense that George is doing that one. And we know he loved Blonde on Blonde. So yeah, great performance. And it's not on the album, but he also does cover If Not For You, and there's footage of that. And then really cool performance of My Back Pages based around the Byrds cover, except this time, unlike the Byrds, we actually get all the verses, which whenever anybody talks about how great the Byrds covers are, I'm like, yeah, they're fine, but they always take out, 4 or 5 of the verses. Yeah, so it makes me mad, but it's great. McGuinn starts it, and Petty sings a verse, Neil, Clapton, George, Bob gets a verse. I think actually George sings the final verse of it.
That's the best, the ultimate showmanship, right? Bob sings his verse, steps aside, and lets the Beatles sing the last verse of his own song. Incredible. That is one of the coolest parts of that whole performance. Yeah, Bob by all rights should have sang the last verse, but does he? No. He steps out and lets George sing it. Yeah. Unbelievable. Love that. I absolutely love that video.
Yeah. There's definitely a bit of studio doctoring from after the fact. You can tell by watching the performance. You can see things that are like, well, that's not happening right now. But, most of it is live, maybe some vocal touches here and there, but a good solo from Clapton and a great solo from Neil. And then, they're all on stage too. George does guitar and backing vocals on Knocking on Heaven's Door as well. Just a cool concert overall. Obviously, all those people we just named, Mellencamp is there, Willie's there, the band, Emmylou Harris, Roseanne Cash, Tracy Chapman.
And If Not For You, G.E. Smith did some nice slide guitar.
Yeah, G.E. Smith, I think, was running the house band because G.E. was in the first iteration of Bob's never-ending touring band. And I think, it's him and Booker T and the MGs as the house band. And then the Heartbreakers are also there, kind of doing secondary stuff too. It's like, well, if you're going to have a house band, the MGs and the Heartbreakers are pretty damn good house bands.
Were you at that show, Jeff?
I was not. No.
Wow, I would have thought you had been
I
there.
had a gig that night, unfortunately.
No, okay.
I know. Simon Townsend was living here in this apartment at the time, and we videotaped the pay-per-view and got drunk and watched it, got high and watched it afterward. Don't try this at home, kids.
So
An amazing show.
Looking at the timeline here and looking at the time we got left, just to skip ahead, we've talked about a lot of these things. Obviously we know George's last semi-public performance. He does the VH1 studio performance in '97 when him and Ravi are promoting Chants of India, and he gets a guitar in his hand, and John Fugelsang is kind of egging him on, like, come on, George. And we get the first performance of Any Road,
yeah,
and he does All Things Must Pass, but he also does If You Belong to Me, which is on Wilburys Volume 3 and originally sung by Bob, which is, I think, pretty special.
No matter what, he gets Dylan in there.
Yeah. And then, we could do a whole, and maybe should do a whole show on the Concert for George. I actually just joined my buddy Sam Wiles, who does the Paul or Nothing podcast, to talk about the Concert for George. Sorry. We can't talk about the competition, but that happens in
Pepsi and Coke, man.
Yeah, that happens in November of 2002. Dylan isn't able to make it over, but a few weeks before, November 13th, 2002, and this is just about a year after George's passing, he's playing a show at Madison Square Garden, and he says there's a tribute going on next week over in England for George. He says, there's all kinds of people there. I'm not sure who, but we can't make it. And I just wanted to do this song in remembrance of George because we were such good buddies, which for Bob to say something like that on stage is really, really touching. And so they close out the show with a very moving, I think, rendition of Something. And I just think that's very noteworthy and very, very
it just
nice.
would have been so cool if he could have been on that concert, but he was touring.
Yeah,
that would have completed a perfect night. It would have been even better.
He's really the one major missing link at the show. You got Ravi, you got the Python crew, you got Paul and Ringo, Clapton, and, the other living Wilburys. Dylan's
I was wondering about Gary Wright, because he was really close with George and he didn't show up for that.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem as glaring an omission.
Oh, no.
I don't think, as Bob. And then,
this interview from Bob Dylan by Jan Wenner for Rolling Stone's 40th anniversary issue. Wenner says, what was your relationship with John Lennon like? Dylan said, somewhat competitive to a certain extent, but not really. Him and McCartney both, really. I mean, they were fantastic singers. Lennon to this day, it's hard to find a better singer than Lennon was, or than McCartney was and still is. I'm in awe of McCartney. He's about the only one that I am in awe of, but I'm in awe of him. He can do it all, and he's never let up. He's got the gift for melody. He's got the rhythm. He can play any instrument. He can scream and shout as good as anybody, and he can sing a ballad as good as anybody. And his melodies are, effortless. That's what you have to be in awe of. I'm in awe of him because he's just so damn effortless. I just wish he'd quit, Everything that comes out of his mouth is just framed in a melody. I've heard many people quote this about Dylan being in awe of McCartney, but
it's an awesome quote, because, people were saying, like we said in the comments, like, hey, how come you're not it's like, well, the reality is that Bob and Paul didn't have as much of an outward relationship or seemingly an influence on each other. But as you can tell by this quote, they're two titans and they are in awe of each other. And it's one thing for Bob to come out and say this, and it's so moving. I love the audio clip of hearing Bob say this. You could taste I'm in awe of him. It's very clear. But the fact too that he's saying it to Jan Wenner, who undermined McCartney at God knows how many points in history at numerous points.
Don't get me going here.
Exactly. And Wenner was always the Lennon fanboy and a Dylan fanboy. And he starts saying, what was your relationship with John Lennon like? He wants to talk about that. And for Bob to turn it around and say, let me tell you about McCartney. I think that is so fantastic. It's a great quote.
Very cool of him.
That is Bob's sense of humor, and that is Bob's way of doing the F you. mean, it
Yeah.
just that.
So good.
All right, 2012, Dylan releases his album Tempest, which has a long, very long tribute to John, Roll On John, which has references to Come Together, Slow Down, and A Day in the Life. Just wanted to read some of the lyrics here, which is just so powerful. I heard the news today, oh boy, they hauled your ship up on the shore. Now the city gone dark, there is no more joy. They tore the heart right out and cut him to the core. Shine your light, moving on, you burn so bright, roll on, John. So moving right there, definitely.
Yeah, it's not, admittedly not one of my favorite songs on that record, but just for the sentiment of it, you know, it's hard for me to not, you know, revere it to some degree. And Dylan didn't do that a lot.
I wish I could remember, but I was in Duluth, Minnesota a couple weeks ago, and was a judge at a songwriters contest, and the songwriters had to sing one original song and one Bob Dylan song. And this guy, I can't remember his name right now. This guy did Roll on John, and he nailed it. You know, sometimes, you know, it was like, you know, my gateway drug, as I said last episode, was the Byrds. You know, that's how I sort of got into Bob. This guy, there were a lot of people in the audience who knew that song, because these are like diehard Bob fans, but heard it anew because this guy gave it a sort of lilt and a little bounce, and really brought out the melody. And if people want to dig that up, it was the Sacred Heart Music Center's YouTube channel. It was the Bob Dylan Duluth Dylan Fest Songwriters Contest. It's about midway through. It's just phenomenal. I mean, I really encourage people to look it up.
Yeah, that's awesome.
If only I could remember his name.
It's surprising that, I'm sorry, again.
No, it's not important.
Does it surprise you it took this long for Dylan to write a tribute to John?
I'm surprised he did it at all.
Yeah,
right.
that's what I was gonna say. He rarely.
Who else has
I mean,
he done tributes to? You know,
Lenny Bruce.
I mean, you know,
Lenny Bruce. Yeah.
Lenny Bruce.
Yeah, maybe, you know, and hints at, you know, so you could, I think, argue that some of his, you know, 60 songs are, I mean, Song to Woody, obviously, Woody Guthrie, but yeah, I am surprised he did it at all. And it's it is a very, very moving sentiment.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed it from the minute I heard it. I was like, wow, he's, you know, memorializing John here.
Just the fact that he did it is cool.
Right, right.
All right, a few more things. May 1st, 2012, Early Takes Volume 1 has and a demo of I'd Have You Anytime on there, plus George's cover of Mama You've Been on My Mind, which is phenomenal.
Right.
Again, you hear Mama You've Been on My Mind, and it's like, why didn't he release this all these years on one of his albums? But it's nice to have that cover on there. Early 2014, Dylan records a cover of Things We Said Today, which is on The Art of McCartney. Yeah, on December 3rd of 2014. Oh, eventually released on The Art of McCartney.
Right.
And okay,
I really like it. I like that version a lot.
Cool.
It's definitely got that nice sort of, you know, rolling rhythm to it. You know, very typical of a lot of Dylan's later era stuff. And
well,
yeah, I mean,
and it's funny because one of us, I think it was you, Dylan, mentioned it when we were talking about Hard Day's Night in the previous episode, being kind of Dylan-esque. So yeah.
See, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that when you said that. And I think you said, Jeff, I should have known better. Might have been Dylan.
At least that harmonic.
Okay, there was an early. Okay, you said that too. All right. I didn't hear those songs as being Dylan-esque.
I mean, I just think that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily sound like a Bob Dylan song, but like, I think the lyricism of Things We Said Today is the most impressive thing that Paul had done up to that point. And yeah, I think hearing Dylan sing that is really incredible personally.
All right. February 6th, 2015. Dylan is honored as the 25th Music Cares Person of the Year Paul McCartney sends a video message congratulating him. The recording not publicly circulating. That was nice
So
of
cool
Paul to
that
do
happened. Yeah.
Okay. November 28th, 2016, in an interview posted on his official website, McCartney is asked what Dylan song he would like to cover. He answers, "That's a very difficult question to answer, as there are so many great songs. I mean, Mr. Tambourine Man just comes to mind because it's something you could cover. Singing Dylan songs can be difficult because something like a Rolling Stone, it's so Dylan that it would be hard to get the spirit that he puts on it. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is another good one, you know. I'd put that on a list as well." Love to hear him do some Dylan song.
Yeah, I could see him doing. I mean, those are both Tambourine Man and Hard Rain are both very, very melodic songs. I think that he could do that. I mean, now with the state of Paul's voice, he could probably do any of Dylan's later era stuff pretty good too.
But
All right.
wow.
See, first
Thank
the
you.
Beach
Good
Boys.
night.
I love McCartney 3. I'm not saying. I'm just saying it is what it is.
Hmm.
I wish Paul did more stuff with his gravelly voice instead of trying to hide it sometimes.
Okay, I don't mind his older voice.
I think it's great. Yeah.
2020, Dylan releases his album Rough and Rowdy Ways with the song Murder Most Foul. Makes references to I Want to Hold Your Hand in there and Dizzy Miss Lizzy.
Yeah, really cool. Yeah, for anyone who hasn't heard it, I mean, 16, 17 minutes. Yeah.
Drops it at the height, right as the pandemic is about to explode, and says, "Hey, folks, here you go. Have a listen to this." I mean, only Dylan would do that. You know, here's something we've been working on for a while. It was like March 18th, 2020. Boom. You get this 17-minute track. I'm like, what the heck is this? And it was tremendous.
Yeah, it's this insane non-linear tale, and it's centered around the heart of it. It's talking about the assassination of JFK, but he's also, commenting on, all the existential and cultural shifts in its aftermath. And, he makes a bunch of musical references, including I Want to Hold Your Hand and Dizzy Miss Lizzy. But I mean, it's not for everyone. If someone's not a Dylan fan to begin with, I don't know if Murder Most Foul is going to appeal to them or convince them. But if you are a Dylan fan, I think it's pretty friggin' remarkable.
Mary cross the Mersey and go for the throat.
Yeah.
All right, we're almost. Yeah,
I was just saying, Paul comments on it later that year. He's asked about it in an interview with Uncut before McCartney 3 comes out, and he says, "I always like what Dylan does. Sometimes I wish I was a bit more like Bob. He's legendary and doesn't give a shit, but I'm not like that." His new album, I thought it was really good. He writes really well. I love his singing. He came through the Standards albums. Bob released 3 albums, 2015 through 2017, doing a lot of Great American Songbook Sinatra covers, like a total crooner. But yeah, I like his new stuff. People ask me who I'm a fan of, and Bob Dylan and Neil Young always make the list.
Very nice. High praise there. Yeah. All right, we're almost done here with our show. A few last things. In an interview with Far Out, this is February 1st of 2021, Ringo claims his current favorite Dylan track is When the Deal Goes Down. From awesome. 2006's Modern Times.
Great record.
And I love that Ringo knows that. That's so...
Yeah. Keeping up on Bob.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Paul and Ringo, I'm sure, keep up on what he's doing. I wanted to ask you, I forgot all about this. There was one song Dylan recorded where he uses I Want to Be Your Man, or I Want to Be Your Lover, Baby, I Want to Be Your Man.
During the Blonde on Blonde sessions, he has a song called I Want to Be Your Lover. And the chorus is I want to be your lover, baby, I want to be your man. The rest of the song has nothing else to do with it. But I totally forgot about that. And I don't really know the story behind it.
Okay.
Just sounded good.
Just sounded good.
So all throughout these 2 shows, we talked about the influence that Dylan has been on the Beatles, but can you shed a little bit more light of how you think the Beatles might have been an influence on Dylan?
You want to take this one, Jeff? Actually, Jeff, take this one. I gotta run for just 2 seconds. I will be right back. So Jeff, talk.
Okay, go. Well, look, I mean, Dylan goes electric not long after the Beatles just sort of engulf the world with rock and, sort of a new brand of rock and roll. He puts on the Cuban heels, he puts on the Savile Row suits. I mean, I think there's a real trajectory there in 64, 65, 66 that owes a lot to Beatlemania. And I think, he does it certainly on his own terms, in his own way, in his own style. But, I think he sees what's happening and is like, he's already moving on from folk. He's moved on from sort of topical songs, and he's moved on from, sort of gently toying with bigger arrangements, more instrumentation. But at a certain point, he sees the Beatles, meet the Beatles in all the ways that we talked about on the last episode, sees them on Ed Sullivan like everybody else, and is like, yeah, I want some of that. And that's the next iteration. Of course, it's filtered through his own sensibility. But right. I think it was a huge influence. And I think, further on down the line, I think you can always pinpoint instances where, he's trying to stretch his melodies, or, the chords he uses, or, the topics he's tackling. Bob Dylan's a sponge, so you might not see it so obviously, but you can, you could have any one song could have Tom Petty, Johnny Cash, Hank Williams and the Beatles all in it. It's just, it's in that sort of, again, it's filtered through that sensibility, and it's in that stew that Bob Dylan churns out that you'll never really be able to pick. But there's always a chord change here or there, or a melody here or there, and you're like, oh, that's, that sounds like John, or that sounds like George, or that sounds like Paul. Not to, give short shrift to the Paul fans who are tuning in. He lifts liberally from everybody, as the Beatles each do. I mean, I think, that's the way great songwriters work.
Are there times when, in your mind, you specifically hear something in a Dylan song where you're thinking, that was influenced by John, or that, in the songwriting, I'm thinking in particular?
Yeah. I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head. You guys, I don't know.
I can't myself, but I don't know the catalog thoroughly.
Yeah.
The way that you guys do.
I can't think of any songs that would qualify as Beatlesque, but I'd really have to think about that one. I didn't do my homework. I can't really.
That's all right. That's all right.
Dylan might have.
I completely agree with everything Jeff just said. I didn't hear it.
I'm glad I did you proud of what you.
I'm just asking.
Whiz or whatever the.
I'm asking, are there examples where you noticed the Beatles' influence on Dylan? But I want to cite specifically the songwriting aspect. Are there times when you'll hear a Dylan song and think, wow, I that's a little Lennon-esque, or that's McCartney-esque, or I could hear George do that? All the great artists, like Jeff said, they all filter through all these different influences and different artists.
Yeah, they do. And yeah, like Jeff said, I would need to look through every single song. I mean,
I'm rifling through the catalog. I'm going album by album in my head. And weirdly, there's a song from, I think it's Modern Times. It might be Together Through Life, called Working Man's Blues 2. Number 2. Oh. It's I could hear that by latter day Paul McCartney.
Yes.
It's
totally agree. That's so melodic.
It's got a real melody. It's got the instrumentation Paul likes to use now. It's got the, that's the sort of room drum sound that, and you could easily just replace Paul's vocal on that. And it's got that strong melody, which is unusual in even on that record, which is more blues based. So, I'm going backwards through the catalog. So I'm down to like 2006. So hang on.
I would say in general, I mean, to be honest, when you think about all of the Beatles contemporaries, Bob, and this is a conversation I was having with some other people in a forum the other day, Bob might be the one artist where you can say his influence on them outweighed the inverse, their influence, which again is not at all to say they didn't influence him in a lot of ways, but like trying to think about the question, like, do I hear any Dylan songs where I think lyrically he was inspired by Lennon and McCartney? Honestly, no, I don't. But I do think that the Beatles' overall presence and what they were doing absolutely, at least subconsciously, played a factor in him, wanting to focus more, being more open to focusing more on, personal songs, not necessarily like less topical songs, but like, yeah, him not being afraid to, bare parts of his soul, even if they were still kind of coated in the surrealistic imagery and whatnot. But
I mean,
yeah,
it's hard to imagine though the trajectory Dylan would have taken if Beatlemania hadn't come along.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%.
Where would he have gone from folk to kind of rockabilly-ish, and then what would have come next? It probably would have just leapfrogged to maybe more country blues, that sort of
100%. Yeah,
please,
please don't mistake what I was saying.
Yeah, no, I know.
The Beatles had
I'm
no
not
influence.
disagreeing. I'm just sort of adding to what you're saying.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
but yeah, that's what I would say.
Andy, you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think they both complemented each other. I think the electric thing obviously put ways in. I think Jeff's right. He would have just skipped that and just gone into country, but I think it was a healthy respect at times. I don't think it ever got too, it was maybe just a little bit, I don't want to say it was just friendly. It was a friendly competition. Clearly George was his soulmate and his brother, and from the minute they hit it off, and the history is going to tell us that. So his relationship with the other Beatles, notwithstanding, as we went through it all, obviously appearances here with Ringo were plentiful throughout the 80s and 90s. So it was a healthy relationship. The John one is the one where, it kind of tiptoes, like it's like the love-hate, and they're both too big. They're both two of the same kind of person. The ship was never going to just, they were never going to be buddies like him and George, and, the same thing, like with Paul too. Like that quote was great. I could never be like him. They're just too different, but a healthy respect all the way around.
Now, the last show that we did, Jeff, you said that when it came to George Harrison's music, you always hear Dylan.
Yeah.
In all of his stuff. I mean, there's so much spiritual music, and he's got a lot of variety in it. Certainly the more folk-based stuff. I mean, when I hear Pisces Fish, that's definitely to me a Dylan influence, right there.
Yeah, I just think his delivery and as George's solo career progressed, particularly after there was sort of the first couple of records which were just amazing, and then there's the sort of middle 70s period, but after the George Harrison record, they have a much more Americana vibe to them. Mm-hmm. I always hear Bob in those records, in the George Harrison record, in Gone Tropo, in Somewhere in England. Yeah, I mean, it's his delivery, the cadence of his voice, the way he kind of jumps vowels, and it's just that it just feels like
want some moon papa, nothing like Frank Zappa.
There you go.
Not new wave,
yeah,
it's there.
Now I'm going to hear that song in a completely different way from now on.
I
just
love
dial up the AI.
Wake up,
put it in Bob.
Yeah, there you go. Just do AI it.
Yeah.
Oh wait, that's Blood from a Clone there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Going through this list, and we've skipped around. There's some certain quotes, some certain live Dylan covered Nowhere Man back in 1990, really terrible rendition of Nowhere Man that he did 1990, and a few other things like that. But, we've talked about a lot of really heavy and important things, obviously, just the overall impact and influence on each other. These crazy huge, between Cons for Bangladesh, the Wilburys and everything like that. But the last two things here on the timeline, I'm really happy, are both very, very funny quotes, and I'm glad that we kind of get to go out on these. And I work at a bookstore, and I was just actually on my break today looking through the lyrics 1956 to the present, released 2021 by McCartney. And I just love this quote. In the book, he says that he recently attended a Dylan show and says, "I read recently that Bob Dylan thinks he does his songs pretty much as they sound on his records, but I don't agree. We went to one of his concerts recently, and it was sometimes difficult to recognize the songs. And in the New York Times, he was quoted as saying he doesn't improvise. I laughed my head off when I read that. I thought it was the funniest thing I've read for a while. He's a great guy, but you just don't know whether he's being tongue-in-cheek." And I think it is funny because obviously that's Bob taking the piss out of someone saying that. And I love that Paul initially reads that and goes, that's not right.
All right. One last thing. And Jeff, you had the honor of interviewing Bob Dylan last year. He put out a book of his own, The Philosophy of Modern Song. First of all, since I never talked to you about this interview, did you meet him in person?
No, it was electronic. It was, he had just come off tour. He was in California. I was in New York City. So unfortunately, next time I interview Bob.
But it's a really interesting interview because it just tells you how his mind works and how he has this incredible knowledge of music from different decades and different genres. And he's very much into the whole aspect of how music affects you and why it affects you. And you hear a song at a certain time of the day, and that can affect you differently than another time of the day. And how did you go about with the questions that you did? Considering the fact that he's got this incredible wealth of knowledge. I mean, he'll talk about a song from the 40s and then blend it into something from today, and he's got that mind where it's all one incredible universe of music. Not so much dividing it all, but
I can't really say, but I think part of the reason he and his team agreed to the interview was because it wasn't a traditional interview. It was for the Wall Street Journal's weekend gear and gadgets section about technology. And so that was just, I think, weird enough that, I don't know why he said yes, but that was the impression I got, that it was just sort of left of center enough, that's why I agreed. And then, I didn't know. So we didn't do the interview until December. I think it first came up as a possibility at the very end of September or early October. And his office sent me the book early and said, "Hey, read the book and send us some questions for Bob tomorrow." So I thought it was going to happen sort of imminently. Now, at that time, he was on the road in Europe. So it was a little difficult sort of pinning down. It was going to have to be like he's going to call you when he gets on the bus or from the dressing room or, one of those kind of things. So I didn't really think much of it. And it has to be, it's a 20-odd question. So I think I wrote 25 or 30 just so there'd be extras, but it was just sort of like bullet points. It was really rough. And it was just the first thing that came into my head that I would want to know, just having read the book. And if I were going to have a conversation with Bob Dylan, this is sort of the direction I would want it to take. Sent him in. And then a couple days later, the office got in contact and they were like, "Bob likes your questions. So those are kind of going to be the questions." and it wasn't like, I don't want to make it sound like it was set in stone, like those are the questions. But I got the impression that it needed to be in that ballpark. And it was because I think he gets asked still to this day, what was it like to be the voice of a generation? Or how did you write Blowing in the Wind? Or, I think those questions are inevitable, especially as we get further and further from when he was a young man. People want to know, like, how did that person happen? Does that guy still exist? you know? And he doesn't want to be asked those questions. He doesn't want to, you know, talk about that stuff. So this was, a lot of it had to do with the way he was living his life and the way he was exposed to music as a young person at a formative time. And a lot of it was about, you know, why he chose particular songs and what makes a good song. They were more, you know, thoughtfully questions, you know? So I don't really know how I got what I got. The Ringo question was thrown in there because I had sent him samples of previous interviews I'd done. It was John Cleese and Ringo and Janelle Monáe and Deepak Chopra. Those were the interviews I sent him. And so Ringo came up just randomly. And I said, well, Ringo, you know, my question was sort of, Ringo told me, you know, musicians have other skills or can give you, I've forgotten exactly what it was. And he said, you know, he's a really good cook. And Ringo told me he's a really good cook. I mean, I think that just blew his mind. Like, I didn't know that about Ringo. You know, it's like, Ringo's such an interesting cat. You know, I'm like, oh, wow. You know, it was, you know, Bob Dylan is, you know, in some ways has lived a really incredible life. And you can't even imagine what it's been like to be Bob Dylan. And he's not like any other 82, 83-year-old out there. By the same token, you know, it's like talking to a college professor or a scholar. He's really, really sharp and really like, you know, he's just powering through his answers. And he occasionally, you know, you can hear this in interviews where he'll pause to see how the person reacts or if they're going to say something back. And if you're not right there in that split second, he just keeps going. He's not like waiting for you to catch up to him. So it was a lot of it's just getting out of the way and letting him do his thing.
Yeah, your exact question was, Ringo Starr told me that he believes being a good musician and songwriter makes you good at other things, in his case, cooking, because you're in tune with your senses. What are your thoughts on that idea? And he responded, I love Ringo. He's not a bad singer, and he's a great musician. If I'd had him as a drummer, I would have been the Beatles too, maybe. Didn't know he was a cook, though. That's encouraging.
Yeah.
It's great. I mean, it's like, you know, I'm sorry I didn't remember it verbatim because it's even better.
So, Andy, do you have a question for Jeff regarding his interview?
No, I do love the answer that he gave about the Sinatra song, you know, and how Bob just discovered it, the Whatever Happened to Christmas. He was like, the Jimmy Webb song.
Right.
I love that answer because he was like, he didn't even know about it until now. And there's just a stroke of just showing you that, you know, that's where he's in tuned with
yeah, I mean, the really interesting thing is it sounds like he really spends a lot of time listening to music. And I'm not talking about, I mean, I think he's really aware of what's going on in popular music right now, similar to the way McCartney is, or artists like that, Elton, you know, certainly. But he's also listening to, like, you know, music that isn't even on streaming. You know, like music that you can't
stream it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like this really obscure stuff from the 20s or 30s or 40s, just as much as he's listening to like Kendrick Lamar or something. So I think that really, you know, he just loves music and loves song and loves, you know, anything I think that similar to McCartney or Elton that challenges him as an artist, like to think differently or to, I could do that. I could do that my own way, but I could do that too. And it's not just his peers. It's, you know, people from the past and people who will be our future.
Yeah. You know, when you look at not just Dylan's cover records or all the songs that the cover songs he's recorded, but, you know, his, you know, the session tapes, you know, everything he's ever performed live, like the guy, to call him an encyclopedia is almost an understatement. You know, Dylan is, you know, I think I even mentioned it in the last episode, like, as much as he was a student of Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, is a student of Cole Porter and George Gershwin and all these traditional American and English folk songs and of every genre ever, and his contemporaries. And, it's the reason why he is going to do albums full of folk covers, as well as a Christmas album, as well as what is essentially 5 American Songbook records, because Triple Cut is a triple album, which to me is even more amazing and fascinating that he would say, yeah, I just found out about this. And also pretty inspiring, because I think all of us know so many people, who just give up after a certain point. People who are like, oh, there's nothing good made after 1980. And it's like, if this guy is still not only just listening to new stuff, but still trying to discover stuff that is new to him in his 80s, then what's your excuse?
And at one point in the interview, he mentioned a song called Chip Away by Duff McKagan. And Duff is a buddy of mine, and I forgot to mention it to him before the interview posted. And he texted me, and he was like, okay, you got to call me right now and tell me what happened, because my phone is blowing up because apparently Bob Dylan's a fan of my songwriting. It's like, but he's just looking for good songs. They could be by Duff McKagan or Cole Porter. There's, the field is wide open. I think that's amazing.
Makes you really admire him even more because he's so open-minded.
Yeah.
About all kinds of music. But, what you said, Jeff, one of the reasons I like your interview is that it's so untypical of what you'll have with any veteran artist. They're tired of being asked the same questions. As someone for whom radio was the gateway for everything I listened to, you're asking questions about Spotify, and the advancement of technology today. And is it really an advantage? Is it a detriment? And he has answers for everything. Yeah. So I just admired the fact that you asked non-typical questions. And
well, I mean, part of that, I got to be honest, part of that was because the sort of rubric of those interviews has a tech slant to it. Yeah. And I didn't know if he was going to, he mentioned TikTok at one point. I'm like, what? What is Bob Dylan doing talking? Awesome. And I talked to his office afterward, and they're like, I think he knows it exists. I don't think he really knows much about it, but he knows that these things are happening. But he definitely had an opinion. His grandkids do use that. That was my question. Your grandkids are the delivery system. They're hearing new music is Spotify or YouTube or whatever it is. And the way you heard it was either on the television or radio, And what I meant by that was, he heard Ricky Nelson or things like that. And he was like, I didn't hear music on television. It's like, I think he did, Gene Autry or, whoever it was, sure. Will Rogers, I'm sure he heard music on TV, but he was thinking about the songs. I think, who knows what Bob Dylan thinks, but I'm guessing that he was alluding to the songs more aligned with the book, the sort of great songs from the era when he grew up. And those were things that he had. Like George, he had like the Cat's Whiskers. He's trying to get he was in Duluth in the Iron Range, or Hibbing in the Iron Range, trying to get, the radio stations from Wisconsin or Canada, right? I will tell you this. I visited his homes in Duluth and Hibbing a couple of weeks ago when I was on the road, and they have the one in Hibbing is similar to the McCartney and Lennon homes in Liverpool. The guy who he bought both of them, and he's restoring the Duluth one, but the one in Hibbing is restored to the way it was. And there are a lot of the things from the Dylan's home that are in there. And when you're in Bob's bedroom, he has Bob's record collection from the time. Wow. So he's got like Bob's 45s. It's, it's crazy. And the breadth of some of those records in 1955, 6, 7 were race records that, a Jewish kid in Hibbing, Minnesota probably didn't have any right to have. But he was gravitating already to things that were different than the rest of his friends who were listening to How Much Is That Doggy in the Window or whatever the hell was on the charts at the time.
Right.
Which I'm sure he's also covered at some point.
I don't know about Peggy, but yeah.
Maybe not that one.
Maybe not that one.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut this to a close here. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to remind everybody that if you look in the description box for this video, if you want to read the interview that Jeff did with Bob Dylan, the link is there. It was in the Wall Street Journal. If you want to find out all the dates for Dylan with his band, the Minks, there's a link there to my website for all the New York, New England dates. And also for Andy, for Two Legs and the Other Leg podcast, the links are there for that. I've learned so much from you guys, and I said it before, you should have a podcast together. Really, do a Dylan podcast.
Yeah, none of us has 3 hours a week to do this.
Yeah. Thanks for being our first guest, Ken. We really appreciate it.
Good one.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jeff.
If you want to do something more extensive on the Traveling Wilburys, I'm here for you.
I would love to do a Traveling Wilburys episode. Let's do it.
Okay.
Beatles are my 1, Dylan's my 2, Petty's my 3. Let's go. I am ready.
Okay. Thank you guys for doing this. Thanks to all of you for watching. Belated happy birthday to Bob Dylan. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Peace
See ya.
and love.